Hello, everyone. I am Sherry Ely, and I am the Program Director for Juvenile Justice here at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And one of the functions that I have is to oversee our Military Connected Families in the Courts project. With funding from the State Justice Institute, the National Council started our Military Connected Families project in 2018 to support work with military connected families who find themselves involved in the justice system. The National Council wants judges and those that work in the justice system to have specialized training on the unique issues of military connected families as they relate to child custody, visitation, family violence, including the impact of trauma. In 2019, we created the National Resource Center on Military Connected Families in the Courts. And soon I will place a link to that resource center in the chat. The National Organization for Victim Advocacy, known as NOVA, serves as the training and technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women, advocating for Military Connected Survivors Project. They are our faculty for this presentation today. We have and want to welcome Kimberly Henry, who's the Military Coordinated Community Response Program Manager at NOVA, and Dr. Ava Ramirez N.A., who's the Military Coordinated Community Response Senior Program Manager at NOVA. And I now turn the presentation over to both of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. And hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourself, write in the chat your name, position, location, and even if you have experience working with the military population, that would be great. My name is Dr. Ava Ramirez N.A., and I am excited to be here on the behalf of NOVA. I am also joined by my amazing colleague, Kimberly Henry. I am located in Southern California and Kim is in West Texas. We are looking forward to getting to know you all and providing some foundational information on enhancing support for military connected survivors of DVSAS in veteran treatment courts. And before jumping in, I will preface by saying that although this presentation has a lot of information, it's not going to go into the minute details and it's not going to replace interacting with military connected individuals or military victim survivors. It really is to spark your curiosity and consideration for this special population and why it's important to seek out more information in order to improve your understanding and your services. Next slide, please. Thank you. So listed here is the grant number for our project advocating for military connected survivors. This is why we're able to do this work. We are very grateful to the Office on Violence Against Women. And please know that what is presented today does not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice. Next slide. And our small but mighty team, myself, Dr. Ava, I am the senior program manager for this project. I also work on a separate contract here with NOVA with the Department of Defense, supporting their domestic abuse victim advocate. I am a Marine Corps veteran with prior experience as a military advocate and working with youth and young adults in prevention and intervention. And I'm grateful to be here with you all today. Kim?
Hi, thank you. And I'm very excited to be here as well. My name is Kim Henry, and I am a licensed master social worker focusing on military policy and programs. Here at NOVA, I'm the military CCR program manager, as mentioned. I am a Navy veteran where I served 10 years in the Navy, but I was also, like Ava, a sexual assault victim advocate during my active duty service and then following that as a federal employee. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Next slide, please. And thank you for those who have introduced yourselves in the chat. It's great to see such a diverse group here, and I look forward to our conversations. Please continue to introduce yourself if you haven't already. In this presentation, we have included a few anonymous and interactive questions that I hope you feel encouraged to participate in. We also welcome all respectful and relevant comments in the chat. The Q&A feature is being used as well. And if you have experience working with military connected victim survivors, we do value your insights. Next slide. Listed here are learning objectives for today, which include understanding unique challenges for military-connected survivors. We will also review findings from listening sessions conducted with VTC personnel. We will also discuss how to build and strengthen coordinated community responses. And lastly, we'll cover how to foster a survivor-centered approach in VTCs. And now moving into understanding military-connected survivors. And with that, we do have our first interactive question on the next slide. And to get connected, you can either go to the link in the chat. We both put that in. Thank you, Kim. Or you can scan the QR code to get connected. The question we have for you today is thinking of the word military. What comes to mind? The first thing that comes to mind when you think of the word military. You can add it to the word cloud here or add it in the chat, whatever is most comfortable for you. I see in the chat sacrifice and service. Thank you. They're coming in now. Soldier, war, dedication, veterans, the job structure, service to country, IG report, home, honor, government, honor, babies, regimented, trauma bonding. A lot of good ones. Well, you can continue to add those if you'd like in the chat. And thank you for participating. We like to incorporate this exercise when presenting to different audiences. And although the audiences change, the responses are often very similar, such as the ones that you've identified. And these are helpful to reflect on because they highlight some of the very common barriers and unique dynamics within military culture, military victims experience, and also why many victim survivors will seek off-base community resources and support, which again, it comes back to that why it's important for community advocates and civilian professionals, legal personnel such as you all, to not only be aware of, but be prepared to support them as well. I will also say that if you have zero knowledge or experience with the military, I understand that learning about or relationship building with this population can seem daunting or confusing. And please know that you're not alone in those sentiments. But also, don't let that be a barrier from keeping you from doing so, from relationship building, from building those relationships, from connecting with this population. And regardless of any personal feelings or perceptions about the military, Kim and I encourage you and are passionate about just taking a moment, taking a step back, having an open mind to support that individual that's in front of you. Next slide. So to begin, let's clarify who military connected survivor includes and who should have access to military resources. This is also a population of who you should be looking out for, screening, and including in any of your services or signage around your office or resources. So listed here are groups to include active duty, veterans, reservists, National Guard members, and civilian dependents. Additionally, an intimate partner, victim survivors are included as someone who has been or is currently in a relationship of a romantic nature, such as a current or former spouse, someone who has shares a child or shared a home at the time of abuse, a current or former spouse, and dating partner. So a few points to keep in mind with this population, the National Guard and Reserve members and families can receive some supportive services, such as mental health and counseling, if the abuse occurs while in that active status. The National Guard does have sexual assault victim advocates. However, they don't have domestic violence victim advocates. There's for those services, would receive services off installations. Also for veterans, they would receive some limited services on installation. However, they would rely more on civilian agencies or Veterans Affairs. So there are some unique dynamics and criteria that can influence services. And again, I understand that some of this might be a little bit confusing, But again, why it's important for community members and personnel to have that general understanding and connect with local military bases, connect with Veterans Affairs and advocates who can help support you. I will also highlight that sometimes due to a person's past trauma or lived experience or even military culture on its own, they may not even identify as a victim survivor or what they experienced as abuse or assault. So I will just pose a question for you all to consider, which is for those victim survivors who may not be aware of the severity of the situation or identify as a victim survivor, how are you all in the veteran treatment courts or court system assessing for and reaching out to those military connected individuals? So just something to keep in mind as we move forward. Next slide. So looking at rates of DVSAS in the military, this chart is taken from the Government Accountability Office or GAO report, fiscal years 2015 to 2019. So looking at these numbers, one example is the Air Force. If you were to break it down, you could say that approximately 12,000 cases over 4 years, so an average of 3,000 a year. However, looking at these numbers, it's important to consider what this chart does not tell us. It does not give us every single case because it's going to exclude those that go unreported or the numbers of reports that didn't meet criteria. The DoD and each service branch has its own criteria for domestic and dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And it also does not tell us whether if it was a repeat offender, how many victims were involved in each case, or if each case represents one victim, or if one case included all forms of abuse. So I see a question, do you have post-COVID numbers? So usually military reports come out every few years. So this is the most recent for the GAO report. If you go on to the individual like SAPR sites, which I think we have on the next slide. If you want to go to the next slide, please. Those ones do have a more recent one, but that's going to be just for sexual assault. So looking at sexual assault reports in the military, this comes from 2023. It is available online. You can see the breakdown by each service branch, also by male and female victims, which is how the DoD identifies gender. There is a larger number of female victims here, despite fewer women in the military, so please keep that in mind. An additional point we like to highlight is the statistic, I can talk today, at the bottom, which says an estimated 26% of female service members who were victimized and reported experienced and met the legal criteria for retaliation. And that's significant because, again, it doesn't give us all of the victims who experienced retaliation, only those that met criteria. And this is a huge barrier for military connected victims reporting, seeking services, and it really compounds secondary and tertiary trauma following their assault. Kim and I do a more in-depth training on military culture and impact on victim survivors. And in that training, we do go through more of the unique barriers, such as some of those mentioned in the word cloud before. But retaliation is probably, if not the biggest reason why military victims don't report, because of that fear of the impact on career, how they'll be perceived by other colleagues, the impacts on the family, and even finances because of that small and close-knit community and culture, within the military. So again, why many victim survivors will seek services or disclose to individuals who aren't military affiliated. So for all of you who aren't military connected, it's not necessarily a negative when interacting with this population. However, you do want to have foundational knowledge to be able to best support them. So please keep that in mind. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kim.
Thank you. There are many great questions. So thank you, Ava. I think you generated some thoughts and some ideas and some questions in the chat, and we were able to get to most of them. We'll continue to answer those in the chats. They're all very great questions and why we're here today to discuss on this topic. specifically within courts and the veteran treatment courts, we do want to also hear from you in the regards to what does a DVSAS case look like in your court? Someone asked about veteran statistics or national veteran data, and I responded that that's very limited. The impacts, the prevalence, both while they were in service and after service, the experiences, if it was enlisted versus officer, if the offenders were currently still in the military or not. There's none of that data is really there. There is very much a gap in the data for veterans. And so specifically within your courts, I would like to know, what is your process? You can add that to the chat. You can share with us what DVSAS court cases look like in your court. Do you have a system? Do you have a process? Do you do risk assessments? Do you gather any of this data? I'll give everyone a moment to think about that and share in the chat. Cynthia says that they are collecting data, which is good. Jessica stated risk assessments and collecting data. That is also great. I know working on some of the other projects that we have here at NOVA talk about and train on risk assessments and the importance of that. And thank you, Ava, for sharing some information on MST from the VA. They do have their interpersonal violence program where you can gather more information as well. And as Ava said, we do have another training that we really do go in depth with the statistics. However, for today's presentation, we do want to look at specifically veteran treatment courts, which can include active duty military as well. You know, as a victim or as a family member, a survivor, or someone directly involved in the case. Angie said you do VA screens, but our court doesn't get the information from assessments from the VA. Okay, and we're actually going to talk about that. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. So this is another poll that you can participate in. We would like to know how prepared you currently feel to serve or support military-connected survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, DVSAS, who are petitioners and victims in a VTC, a veteran treatment court case. And this is anonymous, so please, feel free to answer honestly. This is data that we do not collect. This is what we're able to see just for the purpose of this training. Cynthia said in the chat, hardly prepared. Gwendolyn said somewhat prepared, somewhat. Okay. I was really interested to see these numbers because we had not done the training like this before. And so thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being honest. And thank you for being willing to say that you're not prepared and you would like some more information. And that's why we're here. For those of you that are somewhat prepared, I'm sure all of you have worked with survivors, but being able to support them effectively and being aware of the different factors and dynamics that is a part of their journey is extremely important and critical to supporting them. And then we have one that answered very prepared. Sue in the chat said prepared due to being a domestic violence attorney located outside the military base. Yes, we do see that. We work very closely as well with the National Crime Victims Law Institute that provides resources to lawyers and civilian attorneys, but we do recognize those that are closer to military bases might have more experience with these different topics we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so same question, but changing it up just a little bit is the defendants. How prepared do you currently feel to support military-connected survivors who are defendants in a VTC case? A lot of times when we're talking about survivors, we're talking about the victim, right? And at times we could forget that a defendant may possibly be a survivor of domestic violence or dating violence, which actually could have contributed to what they are currently being accused of as a defendant. I see a lot of somewhats and a lot of not prepareds. Um, I see a few, maybe one very prepared. Okay. Preston said somewhat prepared. So this is also good for us to know just as we go through the presentation. But we're hoping that as you leave here today, you do feel more prepared. And that can happen by working together through partnership, collaborations, through participating in trainings like ours today and other trainings that we provide to be able to gather the resources, the knowledge, and the skills to be able to support military connected survivors who are either victims or defendants in a veteran treatment court case. So again, thank you for sharing that. And so I want to jump into reviewing our findings of the Veteran Treatment Court listening sessions, and I'll briefly talk about that here. This is a QR code you can also download by clicking the link in the chat box as well. Or you can, again, scan the QR code. And you actually, this group is the first group that we have presented this to in a presentation. But the Veterans Treatment Court Listening Session Report, it highlights key challenges, gaps, but also opportunities to improve how veteran treatment courts address DVSAS when it involves military connected individuals. And through these recommendations, through these identifying these challenges and gaps, we looked at different things like standardizing practices, making sure that the support is survivor centered, and also enhancing collaboration. And so we're going to talk about those three things today. And so I want to walk through first how we conducted the VTC listening sessions to be able to develop this report. You can see this logo in the bottom right of your screen that says Center for Justice Innovation. We partnered with them in one of their conferences and activities to be able to conduct these listening sessions. And I can share those details on this next slide. We did this in April of 2024 at their VTC, or again, their Veteran Treatment Court Summit. The sessions included about 60 participants, and we divided them into three different categories or populations based on their work. So we had a group of individuals who were non-legal personnel, who could include like administrative staff or maybe even advocates. Then we had a group of legal personnel who were staff, courts, judges. They may have been lawyers, attorneys. And then we had the policy and state administrators. So those are more of the program managers and the policymakers, those that might be providing services or managing programs that are supposed to support military connected survivors. So there were three staff members, both with NOVA and the CJI, Center for Justice Innovation, who facilitated 75-minute sessions. And they did this through different engagement series and strategies and activities to be able to welcome sharing about the experiences that people have in veteran treatment courts and some, again, the challenges and the gaps, but also the opportunities. They also use Menti, similar to what we're using today for the polling software, so the questions could be answered anonymously. So it is important to say that the listening sessions did provide very valuable insights and recommendations. However, the findings cannot be generalized across all VTCs because of the number of participants. But we are hoping through presentations like this and through building partnerships with you and communicating and listening to you that we're able to learn more about what veteran treatment courts are experiencing and what gaps and challenges they need support in filling. Oh, Christopher said you were there. It was super cold. Sorry. I'm sorry. I live in West Texas, as Ava said, so I am not a fan of the cold, and it's freezing here now. So I'm glad that you were there and participated. Hopefully everyone had a chance to download that report. It is a pretty lengthy report, and it is a lot to digest. The way that we broke it up was to make that more manageable. But what we're going to do is briefly review some of the key points, the key findings of that report. So first is that we found that there was limited trust. So survivors that have gone through the veteran treatment court system, either as a victim or a defendant related to a different case, they fear that their needs are secondary to offender rehabilitation. And so essentially, they felt that the VTC was more worried or concerned about making sure the offender was rehabilitated than ensuring that the survivor got the support that they needed following their experience of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, or DVSAS. They also felt that there was a cultural disconnect, so that there are court personnel, there is a structure, there is a process, but not everyone in those positions, or at least the environment that those positions created, was not one that understands military culture and survivor experiences. And so, many of you probably have been doing your job for a very long time, and that's great, and we're happy that you're here. However, there are times when if an organization or an individual or someone in a support role does not understand military culture or the survivor experiences that are unique to military, it can create kind of a disconnect, and that can also impact the trust. And then another finding was inconsistent resources. So just like law enforcement that we see very often, there's a concern of the inconsistency in the reporting or the resources or the process. And that was found in the listening sessions as well when it came to veteran treatment courts, is that there's uneven access to support services across different jurisdictions. So again, for an example, I live in West Texas. We have a town of about 114,000 people, but we are surrounded by rural areas. And so some of the support services that are expected or that you would like to have in your veteran treatment court could be offered to some, but not all. So where are some opportunities for improvement? And again, I just want to state that this cannot necessarily be generalized, and this is not necessarily an attack on veteran treatment courts. This is our way, our team here at NOVA on this project, our way of supporting organizations, agencies, and systems and communities that we know will interact and do interact with military connected survivors. And it is our passion and it is our mission to ensure that we are providing the support that we can to make sure that survivors do receive the best support possible, and that community advocates are really equipped to provide that support. And so here are some different opportunities that was very consistent after reviewing the data and the feedback during the listening sessions. One is education. Providing VTC staff with training on military culture and DVSAS. I had asked a few people who I know kind of in my own area who work with a VTC, a veteran treatment court, if they get training on military sexual assault or military domestic violence, which are more common topic training areas than dating violence and stalking. But they all said no. And so I thought that was very interesting, and it really aligned with what we were seeing in the listening sessions. Is an opportunity to improve is providing that education, coming to trainings like this, having conversations with our team. Next is collaboration. This is a huge part of our mission as well here at not just NOVA, but within this project, is to foster stronger partnerships with community advocates and military agencies. A lot of times, and this is not just in this training, almost every training that we do, Ava and I will hear community agencies that say, well, we don't want to work with the military, we're upset about something, or we tried and it didn't work, or they won't return our emails, or they're too scary. And then we hear the exact same thing from military agencies as well. We don't want the community to be aware of what's going on. We have it under control. We try to work with someone, but it didn't go through. So we're just doing our own thing. But it's very consistent and we see. And so we really, really strive to stress the importance of collaboration. And then there's standardization. There needs to be more developed uniform protocols for addressing DVSAS cases in VTCs. Again, the example I gave you when asking the question about defendants, how prepared are you to support a defendant who is also a survivor of military connected DVSAS? If there's not a standard risk assessment or how which cases are selected to be handled in VTC, what are the repercussions, what are the consequences, what are the connections, what's the process, there has to be standardization. It will help build that trust. It will help build the credibility. And it will help build the support and the system and processes that are needed to support survivors of DVSAS. here are some survivor-centered recommendations. These recommendations came from our team here at, on this project and at NOVA in conjunction working with CJI. But we wanted to make some survivor-centered recommendations to where, again, that report can be overwhelming, but here's where you can start. And here are some basically some values that you can have when you're trying to implement your process, when you're working on your support systems and your procedures. And one is safety first. This was mentioned multiple times when it came to what I had mentioned previously about the rehabilitation of defendants or offenders being prioritized over victims. One of those key elements was their safety. And so it's extremely important to prioritize survivor safety through consistent risk assessments, making sure that those that are offering and providing the risk assessments are trained and prepared to do so properly. And make sure that there are effective protective measures in place. And again, that can be done by collaborating with your community partners and your military agencies. Next is dedicated advocacy. It's very important to ensure that survivors do have access to independent victim advocates. We here at NOVA work with the DoD. We work with other community partners. We work with other agencies and other nonprofits. And we're here advocating for military connected survivors. But we do recognize both in our personal experience and being victim advocates and just in this work, that not all survivors want to seek help from a government agency, whether it be the VA or it be a base or a military installation. Or a military advocate. So it's extremely important to have those connections with your local communities to make sure that survivors can have access to those victim advocates who are independent or out in the community. And last is transparency. I love flowcharts, and I strongly believe in their ability to share information and help others understand. They can be easily translated as well, because there's usually not a ton of text on there. But transparency, that's one of the first key things you can do right now, is looking at what are our policies or procedures and how does it work? And are we sharing that? Are we being transparent in that process? Are we sharing that with our local leaders and community advocates? But being very transparent about the process that's used in your VTC systems. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. I usually like to stop and take a break and a moment and see if there's anyone that would like to have a question answered. Ava is monitoring the chat as well. But I will go ahead and continue and talk about that effective military and civilian collaboration. I'm really, really hoping that you've gained an understanding to why military and civilian collaboration is so important. The primary goal of this collaboration is to make sure that survivors and victims do receive the same standard of care, regardless of where they choose to receive care from, regardless of their current situation, and especially if it involves a veteran treatment court or a program that is working to rehabilitate offenders. We do encourage community agencies to have a CCR team, and we'll talk about that momentarily. And we do encourage, and not just this training, but other trainings, that there's facilitated cross-training and working together. And even looking at memorandums of understanding to formalize those partnerships, and also to promote victim care and offender accountability, and also support sustainability with your programs and the services that you're offering. We do recognize that there is a high turnover both in the military world and in civilian world as well, and that can be difficult. But having effective collaboration, which we have a guide for that as well, having effective collaboration can ensure that those turnovers do not create any challenges in your current process and your services. I see in the chat, Preston asked, what has been researched about the trauma the criminal justice system itself imposes? There has been a lot, there is research out there on that. This project particularly has not done research into that area. We do have information and data numbers that we could share with you post-training. But I can say there has been a lot of research about that, about how the criminal justice system does impact survivors. And it's extremely important to consider. I would have loved, some of you may have watched our 60-minute culture training. If you haven't, you'll have access to that as well on YouTube. But we talk about the different factors and considerations when it comes to being a military connected survivor. It could be retaliation. It could be possibly a survivor was victimized by someone in their leadership. The military, the DoD is a large, massive organization. Going through a criminal justice system, there can be a lot of parallels to that. You're going into a system that you're not familiar with, you're not confident in. You may not be ready to stand up and speak in. You have people who are sometimes telling you what to do because you're not really familiar with the process. But there can actually be a lot of parallels. So when you look at the research into when you look at the research into how the criminal justice creates more trauma or imposes more trauma or what trauma it does impose, you also have to add the factors that that person is military connected and what experiences they've had that really exacerbate those challenges and those that trauma. And you said it, and has any of that been used to adapt approaches to working with victims? That's why we're here today. When creating this presentation, we didn't just look at the listening sessions, which was great information, but we also looked at currently what's happening in the veteran treatment courts and what's happening in criminal justice systems. And there's really some divide actually when it comes to veteran treatment courts, particularly, it's okay, no problem, particularly with the veteran treatment courts even handling domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking cases at all. Some believe that there should not be a process and it should not be involved in, and VTC should not be handling these type of cases because the focus is really on rehabilitating the offender, which can really negatively impact the survivor. But there are others who have taken the approach as well that, you know what, there's nothing we can necessarily do about that to change that policy. There is not a standard across all VTCs on what cases to take and how when it comes to domestic violence, again, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So what we can do is train. And there are resources such as this training and other trainings and tools that we have where people will be able to provide that training or receive that training, use these tools, and again, work together to make sure that that re-traumatization is being minimized. So let me go to the next question. Does your community, your local area, have an established coordinated community response team? And if you've never heard of CCR, that's okay. You may have heard of a SART, which is a sexual assault response team. You may call it something else. But do you have a coordinated community response team that focuses on domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and or stalking? I see some yeses in the chat, some no, I don't know. Molly said that I believe so, but it is not as well known. That's a very good point to make. I've never asked the question, do people know about it? Because it can be there, but people need to be aware of it. So it looks kind of like we have some yeses and some nos and I don't know. It's kind of everywhere here with this question. But my next question would be as well, my next question would be, is there a military component on that CCR? So is there someone who represents the military community or who represents your veteran treatment court or who represents military survivors? I see some no's and some yeses. And that's, honestly, a key question that we ask in almost every presentation is, does your community have a CCR? And is there a military component on it? Or do they just report to you and vice versa? It's extremely important that there's military representation on the CCR within your local communities. And we'll talk about that. Here is another download for you, which I will give you a second. You can either use that QR code or I put the link in the chat. But this is our CCR guide, essentially. This is the Military Civilian CCR Team Development Tool. And it's really a checklist to provide both new and existing, even if you already have one, CCR teams with a step-by-step guide to be able to assess what you're currently doing, your communities, the military in your area, engage with those populations, and also elevate the unique needs of military connected survivors, making sure that what you're currently doing is working towards supporting military connected survivors of DVSAS and that it's effective. Oh, good. Yes, that is exciting. Thanks, Deborah. So here in this project, we really do love to be able to share these tools and create and develop things like this. We are all very busy. We understand that the work you do is a lot, and it takes a lot of work and energy. And so we want to make it as easy as possible for you to be able to say, you know what, where are we at? And this checklist can help you do that.
And there is one question from
Yeah.
above. It says, does VTC only see sexual assault and stalking cases, no other physical assault?
Oh, there you go. I see it. Thank you for asking that question. So that's kind of goes back to some of our gaps that we mentioned before, is that not all VTCs are handled the same. There is a directive, there is a policy on the management of VTCs, but based on the jurisdiction, their resources, the support that they have, the number of staff they have, what does crime look like in their area, VTCs do take all these cases, but not all VTCs take those cases. Does that make sense? Yes, it definitely depends. Thank you. So I want to briefly talk about CCRs. We do have another training where we really go into depth with CCR teams. But I want to provide an overview because again, some of you may actually be doing this, but you don't call it a CCR. Is that a problem? No, not necessarily. But when you start looking at the CCR model, and we also use a collective impact model, you can start to look at different tools and guides to help you and also give you just better direction and structure and support. And so a CCR is a multidisciplinary team. It has military, civilian, and community partners that meet regularly to assess, plan, monitor, and evaluate prevention and response efforts. So I mentioned a SART, right? That's an example it's not necessarily a CCR, but that's an example of a multidisciplinary team that's coming together to respond to sexual assault. There are other teams that are created, but again, when you're looking at what a CCR is and what its goals are, you can really start to ask yourself, again, using one of our checklists, are we doing that and are we doing it correctly? The goals of a CCR is prevention and response, as you see in the top left box here onto the right of your screen. It's also capacity building, building the capacity of your team, of your services, of your programs, ensuring that you're engaging with the community and speaking up. That, again, someone had mentioned in the chat about, I think it was Molly that said, well, not a lot of people know about it. Making sure that the community is aware of a CCR team and what the CCR team is doing and why. That's extremely important because from a survivor perspective, if you're trying to do things survivor-centered and you're trying to operate from a survivor-centered lens, it's very important that survivors are aware of what you're doing and why, and that it's not just a partnership to support the offenders in rehabilitation, but it's actually a partnership to prevent and respond to DVSAS. And engaging with the community and being open about that is really going to impact the trust and success of your programs. And it's also to develop different initiatives and policies that you can implement. So there are 3 different stages of CCR development. 1 is to plan, assess, and engage. 2 is to build your team. And 3 is to sustain and evaluate. And Sue, I see your message in the chat. We will get you the link to VTC policies. Again, you have to think with VTCs, it's complex, right? We have the DoD that has its own policies, the VA and the VHA. However, each state has its own policies and its own jurisdictions. What is defined as sexual assault by the VA is not what West Texas or what Syracuse, New York defines as sexual assault, right? As well as the services that are there for that survivor. So it's very complex. So when you're looking at planning, assessing, and engaging, again, you'll get a copy of these slides, and this really is a summary of the checklist that you downloaded a few slides ago. But you want to look at the military populations in your community and connect with them, not just with the top leaders, but key individuals, key stakeholders, both in the military and civilian side of supporting survivors. And you want to collaborate with them to develop a plan for assessing the needs of military connected survivors. So again, living in West Texas, where there's a great resources and support here in this one town, all the rural towns around it, it's extremely complex and complicated, and difficult to get support and services to survivors in those areas. And so I would want to make sure that I am connecting with some of those agencies that are in the rural areas, or maybe a agency here that has access to all those rural areas, to make sure that we're providing support services there. So here are some military agencies that you may work with. Honestly, that you could use this as a checklist and say, for the active duty, have I connected with someone in each of these areas, each of these offices? And the same thing with the veterans. These are different organizations or agencies. We recognize that social service agencies, nonprofits, law enforcement, government agencies, and support programs can sometimes be overwhelmed and operating with limited resources. But that's why it's important to take the time to engage and collaborate with these other agencies so you can combine resources and combine efforts to be effective. So I wanted to specifically look at civilian agencies. I was going through the chats, looking at where you all are from and what kind of roles you have. And there, I had noticed that there are almost half and half of VTC or court staff and then civilians as well. And so when we're talking about civilian agencies, who are we talking about? Well, think about when you have a survivor who is coming to court, and maybe let's start with as a victim, as a petitioner. When they are coming to as a survivor, what support services do they need and why? Is the offender in the veteran treatment court, is the offender a spouse or an intimate partner that shares a house or a child with the victim? What kind of support or what challenges can be there, right? If you're a VTC court staff and you're trying to help rehabilitate the offender, are you considering the impact that it's having on the survivor, and asking questions that can really help identify the risk associated with that survivor, and conducting safety planning with that survivor? How do you do all that? Well, you do all that by connecting again with these civilian agencies that can be helpful. One is community advocates, so victim advocates at local crisis centers. There's system-based advocates that are focused more on policies and collaboration and community organizing. Emergency housing is a great one. A lot of people sometimes forget about this, especially when it comes to intimate partners. But if you're not married and you're with a military service member or even a veteran, and that person is receiving basic housing allowance or allowance for housing, that intimate partner may not have rights to that. And if that intimate partner is a survivor, that could be a determining factor in that survivor choosing to leave or not, which could also be an impact on helping the success of helping rehabilitate the offender. And so emergency housing is a great civilian agency to connect with to make sure, hey, if we need a room, is there a standard room or area or apartment that we can have in the case of an emergency that may come across our VTC desk? Law enforcement, of course, and criminal justice personnel. Again, what are the procedures? We can get in the topic of military protective orders, which always generates a lot of questions, a lot of discussion. We have a guide for that too, where we separate or compare, I should say, military protective orders with civilian protective orders and no contact orders. But what do we do, right? We've asked law enforcement before, if you have this person who is the victim and this person who is the survivor, the offender, and one of them is military connected, where do you take them? Who do you call? And sometimes they don't know the answer. So it's very important to engage and be able to answer that question and know the process. Also, medical care and mental health services. Those could be great civilian agencies to partner with to ensure that everybody is receiving the support that they need. Because it's not just the offender who may need rehabilitation, but also that survivor. Especially if the defendant or the alleged offender is a survivor themselves, and allowing them to have unbiased care and support to mental health and medical services so they can be effectively and appropriately rehabilitated. Also consider how survivors are put into situations where they may be accused of a crime, or they may be an offender, um, or have committed a crime because they are a survivor and they were doing something at the direction or as a result of their experience of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. That's why having access to civilian legal professionals and attorneys is also helpful in your collaboration. And then last is culturally specific organizations, making sure that individuals are supported and met where they are at, so they can have an effective recovery in their journey. So now that you've connected with these different agencies, how do you build your team? This is a long bullet list. I'm not necessarily going to go through all of them, but it's a guide. Again, that's a summary of what's in the checklist to be able to help guide you in building the team. A lot of times when you get people who are very passionate about a topic together in a room, there starts to be ideas like fireworks all over the place. But we cannot have that. When you're trying to have a great structure and organization, you want to make sure that you're building your team with that structure. Having a leadership structure and identified, having a mission statement that you're all working towards, and asking yourself, do you know what? This is our mission for right now, for the next 3 to 5 years. This is what we're working towards. We are working towards connecting survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault with external resources within less than 72 hours. That's our mission. Okay. So any activities that may not necessarily align with that mission or could be a huge distraction, it may not be the right time. So when you're building your team, you want to consider the great ideas they might have, but what are you working towards and why? And it also talks here about the prioritizing your different areas for action, and then facilitate cross training. I love when I see local law enforcement engaging with military law enforcement, and having the victim advocates there in that conversation, and they're providing cross training on their process and the way that things work and the systems that they have in place. Cross training can be extremely impactful and significantly helpful for organizations and those that are trying to support survivors. I also mentioned earlier creating memorandums of understanding or agreement. Those can really outline the guidelines and the expectations, and also prevent a fall or a gap in services and programs when an individual leaves or when there's turnover, which is almost expected with the military, right? So how do you develop those MOUs? We actually have an MOU template if you'd like access to that. At the end of this presentation, we share our link tree, and we actually have a website that we're going to be launching soon. But on that link tree, you can download this MOU template, which is very thorough. And it helps complete some of these tasks, which is ensuring that you are outlining the roles and responsibilities, identifying any jurisdictional issues and deciding how you're going to work out those jurisdictional issues. And this is important because you're doing this prior to a survivor needing help. You're doing this prior to a case of DVSAS where you're stuck and you say, well, I don't know what we should do. This MOU is there to outline that. It helps with identifying the communication between agencies, making sure that the safety planning process is in place. Something that comes to mind with MOUs as well and safety planning is a survivor thinking about being survivor centered, right? Is a survivor not having to go to 4 or 5 different places to make a safety plan, but for those agencies and those that needs to be involved to be present and create a safety plan that is effective and helpful. And then there is thank you, Preston shared a link, the overview of the VTC. Yes, thank you. There is also when you're creating an MOU, you want to make sure that you're enhancing the options for victim services. For example, working on where I live, there's a huge college campus as well. And again, we're surrounded by rural areas, but there's a huge college campus. And even though that might necessarily not have anything to do with federal treatment courts, I think it gives a good example of ensuring that the options are still there for victims. We had military service members, students on a base that were being moved to the college dorms on the college campus. Well, they have different reporting procedures and different confidentiality rules with Title IX. And so it was extremely important that there be an MOU in place to say, okay, if a military connected survivor comes to you for help, this is how it will be handled. And making sure that cross training was there. We did that. We also ensured that the students that would be staying at the college campus understood that if you report to someone employed or affiliated with the college campus, you may lose your reporting options of restricted and unrestricted. But having those conversations and an MOU really helped outline that. So last is sustaining and evaluating. So you want to ensure that there are changes in leadership as in a routine manner in the different roles, but also evaluating your programs. Going back to a previous example I gave, we want to ensure that all survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence have access to resources within 72 hours. Okay, now it's 2 years from now. Have you actually done that? And if you have, what went well and what didn't go well? What do you need to improve on? And that's so important to evaluate your program to also say, you know what, we can move on to the next. This is sustaining itself. Let's move on to the next mission, the next goal that we have. And then, of course, the session planning, making sure that there's no gaps in your CCR team because of people turning over. So we want to really foster a survivor-centered approach in veteran treatment courts. And how do we do that? Of course, at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about our listening session report and the recommendations that were in there. I did not want to just dump that on your laps and say, read this. I wanted to review some of those key findings. But I do want to specifically talk about survivor-centered approach in veteran treatment courts and how to do that. We're going to start here on the left. It looks like, let's see, I thought I had a little laser I could use, but we will start over here on the left of the screen where it talks about different justice systems. So with different justice systems, survivors and advocates can struggle with navigating military-specific legal systems. Every time Ava and I host a webinar or a training on the justice systems, military and civilian, they go for 2 or 3 hours, and then there's a whole other hour of questions. It's very complex and complicated, and that includes things like military protective orders, which I mentioned earlier. So a solution to that is that courts and advocates can work closely together with military personnel and other legal advisors to ensure that the survivors are protected across all jurisdictions. And again, streamline protocols, be transparent, explain the process, have guides and resources that outline the structure and the process for those that view it and that need help. Next, over here to the left, on the top row, the second box, overdependency on community programs. So many military survivors, military connected survivors, excuse me, they do rely on community-based service, as I mentioned earlier. But they may not always be prepared or understanding of military specific needs. This can also result in community programs responding to a military connected survivor by asking, have you tried the VA or have you went to the base and tried to receive help? If a survivor is coming to an agency out in town, we tell them there's a reason for that. It's not to say that they don't want to, that they're completely against working with the military or the VA or that they shouldn't, but there's a reason. And so the first question shouldn't necessarily be, well, have you already tried the VA or a military installation? The first question should really be like, how can we help you or what support can we provide you? And if VTC staff, are establishing those partnerships with those community organizations, they can ultimately enhance the support and streamline the care for that survivor. Next is cultural considerations, the third box on the top. Cultural considerations include things like unconscious bias, where survivors from diverse cultural backgrounds or even foreign-born spouses, which is a high population, in the military compared to other populations, may face language barriers. They might have limited access to translators. They could be unfamiliar with not just the U.S. justice system, but also the Department of Defense or the UCMJ, the military criminal justice system. And so it's really important for VTCs to consider implementing language access programs or collaborate with military interpreters and cultural liaisons. We do not specifically have the data. It's something Ava and I are interested in looking into, but looking at how many survivors, in general, how many people in the military or are military connected are married to a foreign-born or a foreign-born spouse, or have an intimate partner who is foreign-born, or just not use English as their primary language, because the military is worldwide, right? And so considering that, we know that that is a high population of people, and we want to really advocate for their ability to have access to resources as well. And so as a BTC, that's just something that you can ask yourself is how are we providing support to different populations? Next is military dynamics. At times, there can be a lack of understanding of military culture or the rank structures or institutional betrayal, or other common things that happen in the military, and just the understanding of what military life is like, right? And that lack of awareness and that lack of military dynamics can be really critical in supporting that survivor. So again, cross-training can really help support this. It can help civilian court staff, VTCs understand the structure and the values and challenges in the military culture and military dynamics. The bottom left corner is fear, retaliation, or stigma. So there are different themes that are expressed, not just within veteran treatment courts, but survivors that are military connected as a whole. And it's institutional betrayal. And what that is, consider the military is a very close-knit community. You really, are told, or you're in the mindset that you are supposed to sacrifice individuality for the cohesive whole of the military unit or the service branch, and to ensure that you have a successful mission. But if there's an assault, like domestic violence or another crime, there's that fear, that hesitancy to report because they are concerned for the whole versus themselves, because that's what we're trained to do, is to think about that whole, think about the mission, right? And there's also collateral damage allegations where they can maybe experience secondary or even tertiary trauma and betrayal, depending on how that case is handled or even mishandled. And it can create this, again, nobody wants to go against the grain and wants to be working towards this whole as a structure and as a unit. But as a survivor, if someone is supporting me as a survivor, if I've stepped out of that mindset, then that person may have fear of retaliation themselves, and they're not necessarily a survivor. They're just there to support that survivor. And so that fear of retaliation or stigma and that institutional betrayal is very real. And so courts can really build that trust with survivors. Make sure that the confidentiality is respected. Make sure that they're aware of the process, allowing them to have control in their decisions and how they want their case handled. We aren't going to talk too much about restorative justice, but restorative justice is, justice looks different for everybody. And so supporting that survivor while they're trying to navigate and minimize that fear of retaliation or stigma is extremely important. And then there's financial abuse. Abusers in military households can exploit military pay systems or benefits, such as housing, such as COLA, to control survivors, even just basic access. So survivors can often lack the knowledge on how to regain that financial independence. How am I supposed to move out and rent, a one-bedroom tiny studio for $3,000 and I'm not getting any housing allowance? I might as well just stay here. And abusers know that, right? And so it's really important to consider the level of financial abuse that may be happening when people are going through your veteran treatment court systems. Gender and intersectionality, specifically for this box of gender and intersectionality, it's important to consider male survivors, survivors of the LGBTQIA plus community who are military connected. We understand that there are different changes. There are things that are happening currently that is impacting certain populations. And it's really important that we continue to support survivors, again, meeting them where they're at, recognizing that we all have multiple identities and intersectionality. And because of that, we all need help differently. And again, justice looks different for each one of us. And we want to support survivors really in the direction and way that they need support to recover and to live a fulfilling life. As someone who is a person living with disabilities and has a service dog, even survivors with disabilities need to be considered. I, as a person with a service dog, have asked law enforcement, what would you do if I was arrested? What would you do if I walked into a courtroom with a service dog? How does that process work? Does that service dog have to take off their vest? Does that, can they be present in the courtroom? What if the service dog alerts me? And sometimes they just don't know how to answer those questions. Thinking about different intersectionality and identities and who we are as people and our experiences can really help guide how your VTC is operating and what services and support you're providing. And last is pets. If you don't know, the statistics on pets are pretty astonishing. I believe it's a third, but it may actually be higher than that. So don't quote me on that. But a third of survivors will not leave because of their pets. Survivors really do rely on them for emotional support, but abusers can also leverage that. And especially in domestic violence cases. And so survivors may not leave a situation because of that. VTCs, yes. Thank you, Martha, for sharing that. I was wondering if Martha was in here. They recently did a training on animal cruelty and interpersonal violence in families. A great training, and I highly recommend that you take that and watch that video. Thank you for sharing that. So what can VTCs do about it? You might be thinking, okay, as a VTC, like there's only so much I can do. You can partner with a local rescue, and you can have someone in your VTC say, connect with a local rescue and say, hey, we know that you have foster parents for animals. I used to foster dogs, right? And you can say, is there a home or two, a foster parent or foster household or two for pets that in an emergency or when we're supporting someone through the veteran treatment court system, that they can foster that person's pets for them while we support them in their in their recovery and becoming independent and getting support that they need. So then that survivor knows that their pet is safe, that their pet is at a vetted home, and that they are being fed, and that they're not responsible for all the burden of feeding that pet or providing care for them, and they can focus on taking care of themselves, while again not stressing or worrying about their pet.
Thank you so much, Kim. Such
Yes,
great
thank you.
information that really needs to be considered across VTCs and the criminal justice system as a whole. And again, our project is intended to bridge gaps between military and civilian agencies by empowering and equipping those that will serve military connected survivors, which could really be anyone, including legal personnel. So we want to make sure that you have the knowledge and skills needed to be able and feel prepared to support survivors and their unique challenges. And how do we do that? Well, we are here to help. We provide, as Kim had stated earlier, training and technical assistance, similar to what we provided today, like a webinar. We can do virtual site visits, a number of different content and topics related to military connected survivors of DVSAS. We also have created several toolkits, guides, resources that are provided free of charge. We will have the Linktree access to that later on. We're also going to be hosting a communities of practice, a new cohort for this year, which are small groups that meet virtually every quarter that take a deeper dive looking into military connected survivors, culture, legal challenges, and also provide the opportunity for attendees to network, connect, and problem solve. So far, we have attendees from law enforcement signed up, domestic violence and sexual assault agencies, county solicitors, legal personnel, and university staff. If you are interested in completing an interest form for the communities of practice, I'm going to put that link in the chat right now. Give me 1 second. There it is. And its spots are limited, so please fill that out sooner than later. And next slide, please. Or maybe it's stuck. That's okay. As we close today, we will put our contact information up there. There it is. Thank you, Kim. We are here to support you all with whatever that means, especially to your specific community or position. Here's our link tree, the link, the QR code, our project email Kim and I both have access to, and then NOVA's overall website. We are also very excited. We will be launching a new website specifically for this project. So it's going to be a bigger, more expansive version of the link tree with all of our resources and tools specifically for the Advocating for Military Connected Survivors project. Please stay tuned for that. We will be doing a launch and then a virtual brown bag, 30 minutes, just looking over the website. So stay tuned for that. Please get on our email distribution list. And next slide, I think, do we have a present survey here? No.
Yes,
Nope.
so they are going to ask the NCEJ FCJ team is going to be providing a survey. So we can take questions at this time if you'd like. If there's any questions people would like to put in the chat.
Okay, perfect. And thank you. Please, everyone, fill out that survey. We value constructive feedback. We want to make sure that we're continually improving for all the work that we are doing for you. I don't know if you want to leave the other slide up. I'm sorry, I thought there was one more. But yeah, if there's any remaining questions, comments, if there's something you're seeing, we do have, I think, about 15 minutes, so we can also have conversation as well. And I see another resource. Thank you, Stephanie.